Welcome back. We have another book review for you today. We're looking at Chuck DeGroat's Wholeheartedness, Busyness, Exhaustion, and the Divided Self. The thesis of this book is that the solution to our problems of exhaustion and burnout is not more rest, though that is important, but to become wholehearted. I like to think about it as we talk a lot about how in Christian circles that God has reconciled us to himself in Jesus, and we are reconciled to one another or even to creation, but we are also reconciled to ourselves. And part of what's going on in the exhaustion and the burnout is the lack of reconciliation, or the barriers or the obstacles or the division within ourselves or between ourself and ourselves. And so part of what Chuck DeGroat is doing in this book is laying out not only the problem, but also how the solution to the struggles and burnout that we are experiencing, or many of us are experiencing, are found in life in God, in union with God. And so he says multiple different times that the solution to exhaustion is not more rest, but wholeheartedness. And he starts with a whole section on diagnosis, on what's gone wrong, that division, that exhaustion, the deep-rooted shame, and the desire to avoid the pain and the shame that leads to division within ourselves and parts of us that want to protect us from the outside world or from the pain, or the parts of us that are still scared or running, and that kind of perfectionism of you're always trying to be enough, to try to do enough. And that leads to such exhaustion and inner fracture. And it's a really great section. I mean, it's not encouraging in that sense. It's naming the problem. It's naming just how exhausted we all are. But it's a beautiful section because it does name something that everyone is feeling, whether we are believers or unbelievers, we're feeling, and then names that as division, and it opens up a way into thinking of what's really going on, and that healing, that wholeheartedness is a way to a solution of healing and wholeness. Then in his second section, as he moves toward wholeheartedness, he makes a surprising claim that perhaps we're not spending too much time focused on ourselves, but too little time paying attention. He's not denying the kind of narcissism and self-absorption that we see in our culture, but that's kind of a shallow vision of focusing on ourselves. And we're actually doing a lot of that and not enough paying attention to what's really going on, paying actual attention to ourselves. And by paying attention up here and not diving down deep, we actually find ourselves, again, exhausted and fractured and not actually in touch and reconciled to ourselves. He talks about how much of what we do is reaction and not reflection, because we're constantly in defense mode. We're constantly dealing with what's going on, and we're running, or we're scared, or we're covering ourselves with fig leaves, or trying to be perfect so that everyone will like us, and all of that keeps us from actually paying attention to what's really going on. And we're not really reflecting on what's going on in our hearts, but just reacting to the moment. And I bet many of you, like me, have felt those times where you just feel like you're just reacting all the time and not actually taking time to think about what's going on and what's going on in yourself. In particular, he talks about the different parts of ourselves, and that it's that we have different pieces of us that are trying to protect. So there's a certain amount of self-compassion and empathy that we can have for the parts of us that are actually exhausting us, the parts that are actually dividing us and making us burn out and be fractured, but that part's actually there trying to protect you. Or that part is actually there because it wants to do good. And some of the compassion allows you to say, I know that's what you're trying to do, but you don't have to. Like, God has you. You're okay. you're beloved. And that compassion actually free us to allow God to do the work of reconciliation in us, reconciling ourselves to ourselves. He also talks about how wholeness is not a climb up, but actually a descent. He uses the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the Beatitudes, to look at the way to wholeheartedness. The way to wholeness is not climbing the ladder, but actually descending into humility. And that the humility and attentiveness are the paths to wholeheartedness. He also speaks that there are obstacles in our lives to our union with God, and that God does work to remove those. And those aren't always a comfortable process, and yet it is in some ways gentle. It's not a harsh hammer that God comes through in our lives to smash everything to bring us to wholeheartedness, but there's a gentle move where God's removing those obstacles, removing those barriers to union with Him. In the last section, he focuses on some exercises of wholeness. He's kind of focusing on that union with God. That is the goal, that is the means by which we become whole and wholehearted. And though he does have some exercises at the end of each chapter in this section, one of the beauties of the book is that the solution to our division in our life is not another technique. It's not another 5-step plan, but it is life in God. And so even though these are practices, they're more practices of attentiveness in making ourselves aware of what God is doing and of what God has said in us and to us. So it is a really timely book. It's a really well-written book. I would recommend it. At times, he does fall into some imprecision in his language about union with God. He's following the mystical tradition in this, and so there are points where he falls into what I would say some of the same weaknesses that you see in the mystical tradition, where union is undifferentiated and you almost get absorbed into God. That's a common thing in some of the mystical tradition. I would consider that a weakness, and because he follows that in some places, there's some imprecision on the language at places that I would consider a weakness in the book. I don't think it just distracts or detracts from the book overall. I still think it is a well-written book on a timely topic, and I really appreciate how it helps us think about God's reconciliation of ourselves to ourselves, and that the solution is not another technique, but is life in God. And that when we are exhausted and burned out, we might need a nap, but we also really need to find our identity and our wholeness and our life in God and in Christ, and not in all the running and all the other places that we're looking. So again, the book is Wholeheartedness by Chuck DeGroat. I do recommend it, and I thank you for your time. If you liked this review, please like the video and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification button so you'll be updated on all further book reviews. If there's a book that you think that I should be reading and should review, please let me know in the comments below, or find me on Twitter or Facebook and let me know. And if you like how I think about books or think about theology, please consider looking into some of my own theological work. I've written a book of devotions through the Heidelberg Catechism, and you will find a link to that in the description. Thank you for your time.